HOA locked the gate while my dad was dying. So, I changed the law. I've replayed that night so many times in my mind I could map it by memory. The flickering porch light, the artificial stillness, the blinking red of a keypad that didn't matter when it should have. My father collapsed at 9:53 p.m. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a dropped glass, a strange slur in his voice as he asked if the air conditioning had gone out. But something in his eyes, something wild and absent, told me this was not dehydration or fatigue. "Dad?" I said. He blinked slowly, then crumpled sideways onto the kitchen tile. I was at his side in seconds, dialing 911 with one hand, checking his breathing with the other. His skin was ice cold, sweat beading above his brow, his body limp. I remember the way his mouth seemed frozen open, words trapped inside. "Stroke," the dispatcher confirmed after I described his symptoms. "Stay with him. Help is on the way." They weren't lying. The ambulance reached our gated community, Evergrove Estates, in just under 6 minutes. But that's where the system failed us, because Evergrove's gates weren't just for show. They were digital, key-coded, guarded, and after 10 p.m., locked. No override code, no emergency bypass, just a rule, and a gate that wouldn't open. I remember standing on the curb, waving both arms like a maniac, trying to flag the ambulance down while calling the HOA security line over and over. Voicemail, again and again. The emergency intercom at the gate played a cheerful welcome to Evergrove Estates, followed by an option menu that looped endlessly. The security hut was unmanned. According to policy, night staff didn't begin until 11 p.m., a cost-cutting measure voted in by the HOA 6 months prior. My father was seizing inside the house while the medics stood 30 feet away, powerless to help. I finally sprinted to the gate myself. "Can't we just break it?" I yelled to the EMT through the bars. He shook his head, already on the radio. "We're trying to get a hold of dispatch, but we can't damage private property without authorization." Private property. That phrase rang in my ears like a gunshot. By the time the backup security guard finally arrived at 10:07 p.m. and opened the gate manually, my dad had lost consciousness. By 10:13, he was in the ambulance. By 10:40, we were in the ER, but the neurologist's face said it all. Every minute during a stroke is brain death. My dad had lost 22 of them behind that gate. He survived, but he's not the same man anymore. His speech slurs, his memory flickers like a faulty projector. His dominant hand no longer works. He can't feed himself without assistance. I'm grateful he's alive, but what they took from him, the time, the autonomy, the clarity, was unforgivable. The next morning, I requested the security logs from Evergrove's HOA. Karen Winston, our HOA president, responded with a single-line email. As per policy, the gate system functioned as designed. No violation occurred. Functioned as designed. I stared at the screen, barely able to breathe. They had designed it to fail. They had built a system where a dying man could be left to wait because of key codes and silence, in a 5-minute cost-saving measure. I wasn't just angry. I was activated. I pulled up the HOA handbook. Page 19, section, the 4th emergency protocols. There wasn't one. No guideline for first responders. No resident override. No system integration with county services. Just lines about landscaping hours, fence paint, and how long you could keep a basketball hoop out. I'd spent the last year working full-time as a junior researcher in public policy law while finishing my grad thesis. And now, for the first time, I saw exactly why it mattered. Over the next few days, I started digging. I requested minutes from the last 12 HOA meetings. I reviewed the vote that had removed 24/7 gate staffing. I found emails from residents dating back a year, raising concerns about emergency access. One email even begged, "If someone has a heart attack past 10, are we just supposed to pray the gate opens?" Karen had responded, "If residents follow the rules, there won't be emergencies." I printed that one, highlighted it. Then I went further. I interviewed the EMTs. I requested the dispatch logs. I got the county's emergency response policy in writing. And then I made a new folder on my laptop, Evergrove Nguyen case build, because this wasn't about my dad anymore. It was about all the people who might never get a second chance. 3 days after my dad's stroke, I stood in front of the Evergrove HOA board, dressed in the same suit I wore to my grad school interviews, except this time, my tie felt like a noose. I wasn't just here as a resident, I was here as a son, and I had evidence. The room was filled with that manufactured calm HOA meetings always had, flavored by fluorescent lights, lukewarm coffee, and people pretending they weren't dying to leave. Karen Winston presided at the center of the table like a suburban queen, flanked by her hand-picked loyalists. Her hair was perfect. Her smile was tighter than ever. "Jordan," she said, as I stepped up to speak, "you'll have 3 minutes." I clicked my laptop. The screen behind me lit up with a photo of the Evergrove front gate at night, an ambulance parked behind it, lights flashing uselessly. "This image," I began, "is timestamped at 10:01 p.m. last Friday. My father was inside our home, suffering a severe ischemic stroke. Paramedics arrived in 6 minutes, but they couldn't reach him. Why?" I clicked to the next slide. Evergrove HOA policy. After hours lockdown, no staff on duty until 11 p.m. The audience, mostly bored homeowners, shifted in their seats. "Because of this policy," I continued, "my father lost critical treatment time. The damage is permanent. He can't speak clearly. He may never walk again." Karen interrupted, voice syrupy but cold. "Jordan, we're very sorry for your family's experience, but what?" I said, louder now. "You received multiple emails from residents warning this would happen. You removed full-time gate staffing to save $38,000 per year. And when an emergency happened exactly like predicted, the gate did what it was designed to do: keep people out." Silence. I advanced to the next slide, an excerpt of her own email reply to a resident from months ago. "If residents follow the rules, there won't be emergencies." Gasps. "I'm not here to demand sympathy," I said. "I'm here to demand accountability and change. Because if it happened to my father, it can happen to someone else. And next time, they might not survive." Karen sat frozen. Board member Greg Simons finally broke the silence. "We'll, review your concerns in closed session." "Good," I said, closing my laptop. "Because I've already sent copies of this presentation to the county fire marshal, EMS, our city council member, and a legal team." I walked out before they could speak again. That night, I sat beside my father's hospital bed. His eyes were half closed, his hand twitching like it was trying to remember how to move. "I'm going to fix this, Dad," I whispered. "They don't get to lock people out of their lives." Over the next week, I shifted into gear. Through connections at the university, I partnered with a civil rights attorney named Maya Patel, known for litigating against institutional negligence. She reviewed my evidence, leaned back, and said, "You've got enough for a negligence suit, maybe even wrongful injury." She helped me draft the formal complaint. We didn't just sue the HOA, we sued Karen personally, as the one who enforced and upheld the policy even after being warned. The story spread fast. Within 48 hours of the filing, a local news affiliate contacted me. I agreed to an interview on one condition: they had to film at the gate itself. On live television, I stood in front of that same keypad and said, "My father didn't almost die because of traffic or distance. He almost died because a handful of people prioritized order over access, and no one, not a single person, stood up to stop them." The next HOA meeting wasn't held in the usual recreation center. It was moved to a local high school auditorium because so many people RSVP'd. What was normally a dozen bored retirees now became a crowd of 200 angry residents, most of them never having attended a single meeting before. Karen took the stage like a gladiator entering a doomed arena. She tried to read a pre-written statement about ongoing litigation, but she was drowned out by shouts. "Why wasn't there an override button? You said this would never happen. How much of our dues are being spent fighting this lawsuit?" The mask cracked. For the first time, Karen didn't look composed. She looked cornered. That weekend, I received an anonymous envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside, a flash drive. On it, audio recordings. One file was labeled HOA Meeting SEP 14 Internal Audio, M3. I pressed play. Karen's voice came through clearly. "We don't need EMS access protocols. That just invites liability. If there's an incident, we'll say we were unaware and settle if needed." Another male voice. "You're suggesting we wait until someone gets hurt? I'm suggesting we avoid building a paper trail. That's how you get sued." My hands clenched the edge of the table. It wasn't negligence. It was strategy. By Monday, my attorney had the audio filed as new evidence. We added willful disregard of public safety to the claim. That changed everything. A local paper ran the headline: "Evergrove HOA New Gate was unsafe, chose to do nothing." Residents started organizing. A vote was called to recall Karen Winston as HOA president. Lawsuit fundraisers popped up overnight. What had once been a story about a gate was now a movement. The audio leaked wider than I expected. By Thursday morning, it wasn't just circulating among angry residents or HOA Facebook groups. It had made its way into the inboxes of local journalists, EMS unions, and, most critically, the office of State Assemblywoman Linda Coe, who'd once lost her brother to a delayed emergency response. At 10:42 a.m., I got her call. "Jordan," she said, skipping introductions. "I want to help." I blinked. "You've heard it, I've heard it, and I'm furious. This kind of HOA overreach has been happening unchecked for too long. Your case just cracked open the conversation we've needed to have for years." I couldn't believe it. I was still processing Karen's voice, the smug indifference in those recordings, now triggering conversations at the state level. By noon, a special advisory committee on residential emergency accessibility was being formed. At 3:17 p.m., I received another call, this one from Karen herself. "Jordan," she said, voice brittle. "We need to talk." "We're already doing that," I replied. "In court." "I'm not calling as HOA president," she said quickly. "I'm calling as a neighbor." I almost laughed. "My father is still relearning how to write his name," I said coldly. "We're beyond neighborly chats." Pause. "Look," she sighed. "The board is panicking. There's talk of dissolving the HOA entirely. I think we can come to an agreement if we act fast." "An agreement? Drop the suit. We'll make changes. Quietly. Without press or politics." "No," I said without hesitation. "You had your chance at quiet. You used it to hide the truth. Now everyone gets to hear it." 3 days later, the emergency special HOA recall vote was held. Karen fought to delay it, claimed legal intimidation, cried fake news and edited audio. But the residents had heard too much, seen too clearly. Out of 412 eligible votes, 337 demanded her removal. She was ousted before noon. The crowd outside the HOA office cheered like a regime had fallen. In a way, one had. But Karen wasn't done. Within 24 hours of being removed, she did something that stunned even me. She filed a defamation countersuit not just against me, but also against the anonymous whistleblower she claimed had violated privacy laws by recording the meeting. I was named. My attorney was named. Even my father, my stroke survivor father, was listed in a footnote under associated parties. Maya, my attorney, was livid. "She's trying to scare you. Don't flinch." "I'm not flinching," I said. "I'm thinking." Because that lawsuit, it told me something important. She was cornered. People with nothing to hide don't countersue whistleblowers. They fix problems. Karen, she wanted a smokescreen. I needed more fire. So I turned back to the one thing Karen feared more than media: numbers. I requested the HOA's financial disclosures for the past 5 years. As a dues-paying resident, I was legally entitled to them. After some stalling, the interim board handed them over hesitant, but cooperative. At first, they looked normal: landscaping, gate repair, security contracts. But then I noticed something subtle: a monthly consultation fee paid to a vendor named CivicX Solutions, $3,800 per month, every month. No description, no deliverables. I searched the name. It led to a P.O. box and a disconnected website. Curious, I filed a business entity search at the Secretary of State's office. Owner? Greg Simons, Karen's former board ally. It was a shell company, one that had collected nearly $200,000 in consulting fees since being created. I almost dropped my coffee. This wasn't about a gate anymore. It was systemic abuse. That night, I called Maya. "Are we still suing them for endangerment?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because we're adding fraud to the list." The next HOA town hall was surreal. I took the podium again, this time, not with a photo of an ambulance, but with spreadsheets, transfers, bank records. While my father was locked behind a gate, I told them this board was quietly approving payments to a fake company run by one of its own. The room gasped. Greg Simons, who had since resigned, was nowhere to be seen. I clicked to the next slide, a timeline of payments, matched against board votes. They knew what they were doing, and they funded it with our dues. When the local news station ran the headline, "HOA misconduct deepens, corruption found beneath gate controversy," my inbox exploded. Other residents from different HOA communities began emailing me. They had seen similar patterns. They had stories. Some had proof. I realized we weren't a story. We were the spark. By the end of the month, Assemblywoman Coe introduced the Emergency Access and Transparency in HOAs Act, designed to Mandate 24/7 emergency gate access in private communities. Require publicly posted HOA emergency protocols. Enforce independent audits for any HOA handling over $500 gear. My dad would never get those 22 minutes back, but maybe someone else would never lose them. Karen eventually dropped her countersuit. Greg disappeared from public view, but we weren't done. I was working with 2 legal clinics, drafting HOA reform toolkits. Maya and I began advising a class action group. And Evergrove? They voted to replace the entire board. Only one member stayed, Miss S. Henley, a retired librarian who'd abstained from every vote under Karen. She once brought cookies to a meeting. Now she chaired the audit committee. The gate was upgraded. Emergency access installed. A red button, protected but direct, linked to dispatch. I asked the technician what would happen if it was pushed. It overrides everything, he said. Finally. It's strange how quickly people forget what silence used to sound like. Before all this, before lawsuits and legislation and whistleblowers, I lived in a neighborhood that was quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of quiet built on fear of HOA emails and fines for leaving your trash bins out 30 minutes too long. Now, the quiet is filled with conversation. Neighbors who used to nod from behind blinds now stop to ask about court dates. Families once terrified of board retaliation now walk dogs past the clubhouse and ask where to sign petitions. There's a word for it, liberated, but I didn't feel liberated. I felt raw, because while the headlines were celebrating, my father still couldn't tie his shoes. It had been 6 weeks since we filed the expanded lawsuit now charging the Evergrove HOA and former board members with negligence, financial misconduct, and ethical violations. 6 weeks of depositions, strategy sessions, and media interviews. 6 weeks of reliving that night in every conversation. I was tired. I didn't say it out loud, but I was. And I was angry that the burden of change had to come through pain. Then the state called. Assemblywoman Linda Coe's assistant scheduled a meeting with me in person at the Capitol. I brought Maya, my attorney, and a binder labeled The Gatekeeper Doctrine. That was my name for what this had become, how systems built to control people always began with justifications of safety or order until they grew teeth. In the legislative hearing room, I sat at a table across from a panel of 7 lawmakers and began to speak. My name is Jordan Nguyen, I said. My father suffered a catastrophic stroke, but it wasn't his health that nearly killed him, it was policy, HOA policy. I walked them through it all without the fire of earlier speeches, but with the slow, methodical pain of someone living it daily. The ambulance, the locked gate, the voicemail, the timer that ticked while neurons died. Then I laid out my proposal, the Gatekeeper Doctrine, core principles, emergency access law. All gated communities must provide 24/7 verified access to EMS services without resident input or approval. Public transparency mandate all HOA security policies must be available publicly and filed with the local fire and EMS departments. Ethics accountability clause HOA board members who knowingly ignore safety violations may be held personally liable in civil cases. Annual independent audits. Any HOA handling over $250,000 annually must undergo third-party financial audits. Resident right to record residents must have the right to record public board meetings, regardless of HOA media rules. It wasn't just policy, it was a shield one I wished I had 6 weeks ago. When I finished, the room was quiet, not the same kind of silence. This one was heavier, heard. That afternoon, Linda Coe made it official. The Gatekeeper Accountability Bill would go to committee with bipartisan support, but the more noise we made at the state level, the more resistance appeared at the local one. A coalition of other HOA boards began pushing back, publishing op-eds about government overreach and protecting private residential sovereignty. They claimed people like me were emotionalizing rare incidents to justify invasive laws. Rare? I uploaded the 37 emails I'd received from across the state, each detailing near identical situations: locked gates, delayed ambulances, ignored requests, a mother in Lakewood, an elderly man in Brentwood, a diabetic teen in Auburn. We weren't rare. We were invisible until now. Karen, however, was no longer invisible. The legal system had finally caught up. Her personal finances were frozen pending civil trial, and the State Ethics Committee had opened a formal investigation into her tenure as HOA president, including the fraudulent consulting payments to Civic X Solutions. I thought it would feel satisfying, but standing in the courtroom during a pre-trial hearing, I felt none of it. Only a cold, clinical ache. The judge asked if I would accept a settlement offer. Karen's attorney offered a full HOA reform package, install emergency gate access, approve transparency laws internally, pay $250,000 in damages and legal fees, issue a written apology to the Nguyen family. I looked at Maya. She looked at me. No, I said. No, the judge repeated. I don't want a private apology, I said quietly. I want this on public record, and I want the gate fixed before someone else dies. A week later, the HOA folded. They agreed to all terms without confidentiality clauses. Karen was banned from holding any leadership position in any HOA for 10 years. The new board, elected in full, signed a community charter committing to transparency, access, and resident equity. I never thought I'd live to hear the phrase resident equity in an HOA meeting. But there it was. The final surprise came in an envelope, no return address. Inside, a simple handwritten card. I hated you for a while because you made us all look in the mirror, but I needed to. We all did. Thank you. A neighbor you'll never meet not long after. My father had his first major speech therapy breakthrough. 3 words. Slow, slurred, but his "you" did good. 6 months after the night my father collapsed, I stood at the front of the Evergrove Community Center again. But this time, there was no lawsuit, no shouting, no projector casting evidence onto walls like a courtroom drama. Just neighbors, real ones, talking, listening, laughing even. And on the table beside me, a printed, signed charter titled, "The Resident Bill of Emergency Rights adopted by Evergrove HOA, ratified by the State Housing Committee." We'd made it law. The Gatekeeper Accountability Bill passed the Assembly 3 weeks earlier, nearly unanimously. HOAs across the state now had 6 months to comply with its 5 provisions: emergency access, transparency, audit requirements, resident protections, and public safety enforcement. For the first time, gates could no longer stand between people and their lives. I never imagined this would be my legacy or my burden, because victories don't always feel like fireworks. Sometimes, they feel like an exhale you've been holding too long to even notice. My father came with me to the ceremony. He walked slowly, carefully, but he walked. And when I handed him the microphone to say a few words, the room stood in silence. He cleared his throat. "Thank you for giving me time I almost didn't have." The applause was thunderous. He smiled, but I saw the tears brimming. So were mine. Later that evening, as the community mingled around refreshment tables and kids drew chalk on the sidewalk, I found myself alone by the new gate. It had been completely redesigned, sleek, secure, and most importantly, integrated with county EMS. No more keypads, just a dedicated dispatch override with camera verification and a 5-second delay. It was quiet, the good kind of quiet this time. Big difference, huh? I turned. It was Mrs. Henley, our newly elected board chair. She sipped her lemonade and looked at the gate like someone studying a finished painting. "You did something incredible, Jordan," she said. "You didn't just fix a gate. You changed the way people think about them." I nodded. Funny. It started with trying to keep people out and ended with making sure they could get in. She chuckled. "You ever think about joining the board officially?" I raised an eyebrow. "I think I've had my fill, but you're the first person in this neighborhood to ever get a law passed. And I'd like to keep it that way," I grinned. In the weeks that followed, my story reached beyond the state. 3 other states contacted Assemblywoman Coe's office for draft versions of the bill. A national podcast ran a segment called HOA Hell, with our case as its centerpiece. I received letters from EMTs, nurses, and other families thanking me. One message, from a paramedic in Texas, read, "We lost a patient at a gated community last year. No override. We didn't even get sued. Just buried the story. You did what none of us could. You held someone accountable." I read that one 3 times. Then I cried, not because I was proud, but because I realized how close we came to becoming just another buried story. Maya, my attorney, was nominated for a Public Interest Litigation Award. She brought me as her guest. During the ceremony, they played a short video montage of landmark cases. Then a clip from mine, the gate, the lights, my dad. The room went silent. "Change," Maya said in her acceptance speech, "doesn't always come from loud places. Sometimes it starts at a locked gate and ends in a law book." Afterward, a young law student approached me. notebook in hand. Mr. Nguyen, she said shyly, you're the reason I switched to public law. I didn't know what to say. I just shook her hand and whispered, don't stop. Back in Evergrove, things were normal, but better. You could feel it in the way neighbors didn't flinch when a board member walked by, or how nobody whispered when someone installed a bench in their front yard, or how they voted in new leadership without intimidation. We even had our first community resilience fair, where residents shared emergency plans, resources, CPR training, and first aid. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. One Sunday morning, I found my father in the backyard standing at the small herb garden he'd once loved. He turned when I approached, his cane steady against the raised bed. Smells like mint. Yeah, I smiled. You planted it years ago. He nodded slowly. Did good, didn't we? We did. He looked at me, brow furrowed, and thought, gate open now? I swallowed. Always, Dad. He smiled. That smile, tired, crooked, but alive, was everything. People ask if I regret not taking the settlement, if I regret the interviews, the stress, the courtrooms, the endless meetings and policy briefs. And I tell them this, I regret the gate wasn't open 6 minutes earlier. But I don't regret being the one who made sure it never closes again. Evergrove became the first HOA in the state to comply with the Emergency Access Act. Karen Winston was barred from any community leadership position for a decade and ordered to repay over $120 in fraudulent consulting fees. The Gatekeeper Accountability Act inspired similar legislation in 4 other states within the following year. Over 1,400 HOAs updated their emergency policies voluntarily. And me? I wrote it all down, turned it into a guide for residents nationwide. Gates, grievances, and ground rules. How to take back your OA. It reached #3 on a law book bestseller list. Not bad for someone who just wanted his dad to get help. And now, when I see that gate, its quiet hum, its open channel light always glowing, I think of what it once represented. Power, control, delay, silence. Now, it stands for the opposite. Access, justice, urgency, life. It's not just a gate anymore. It's a promise.